Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Everett and my story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2014 when I was about 17 years old at the time. I was born and raised in rural Kentucky, where I've lived all my life on a small farm with both of my parents and my sister Maya. We are surrounded by many other rural properties in the immediate vicinity that all grow corn, hay and soybeans on a much smaller scale than our larger counterparts. I live in a really beautiful part of Kentucky with forests, high ridges and narrow V-shaped verdant valleys, sharp mountains, pretty ponds, pebbly streams, rivers and silvery lakes. And of course we are the quintessential land of coal, with our tallest landmark being Black Mountain. I'm glad to say that my friends and I have never allowed the modern technology available these days to suppress or subdue our passionate interest, ardent fascination, and inquisitive curiosity for the natural world. So from a very young age, we all learnt to hunt, camp, fish, and hike. I'm so lucky here because I can literally ride my mountain bike down a long dirt road where I reach a slight hilly embankment that is flanked by high grasses and brambles on its outer edge. But if you walk over a small precipitous clearing and follow a rugged dirt path, you immediately enter a magical area of forest which is idyllic all year round, except of course in the dry season when everything can get very dry and brown and the trees lose all their leaves. The forest consists of statuesque oaks, red maples and yellow polar trees, and this has been my favourite haunt to hang out since I was a very young boy. It is here that I would meet up with many of the local boys. We would explore this incredible forest that goes back for many miles. Words fail me to describe how spectacularly magnificent this shaded sanctuary actually is. I think the vast age of the trees found here adds to their appeal, their mystery and intrigue. These imposing trees rise up to the sky like masterful giants, with the grace of ballet dancers and with boughs that crisscross each other at 100 feet off the ground, providing a vast parasol or canopy above an extensive area. Prisms of light dance through the branches, lighting up this dreamy, enchanting oasis in a soft, luminescent, very subtle light. It's always so spectacularly cool in here, especially in the heart of a sweltering hot summer's day. I love the way the forest floor is literally swathed in lacy ferns, pretty mosses, unusual fungi, interesting shaped boulders, and so much more. You will also find streams of cascading water running through this magical woodland space. There is so much to love about this place. Over the years, if I ever had a single bad day, I would automatically go to the forest to lift up my mood and regenerate my spirit, and it worked every time. My great-great-grandmother, who's a very wise woman, told me a true story once about a man called Gabriel Harris, who lived in the 1800s here in Kentucky. The man was down on his luck and felt as if his life had hit rock bottom, as everything had turned sour for him. His best friend had stolen his long-time sweetheart, and he had suffered huge financial setbacks with a very bad tobacco crop that year, that had been eaten away by tobacco rot that had ravaged everything, leaving him penniless. It was then that he decided he would go to the forest to hang himself on one of the trees there, and this is what he wrote about the experience in his own words. The forest beckoned and welcomed me, swaying her leafy boughs like an old friend, and I felt enveloped in her ancient love, while the soft breeze caressed and kissed my cheeks, and the branches of the trees danced, while the leaves rustled and the birds sung their joyful chorus. I was so beguiled by the beauty of this shaded, verdant sanctuary, and so strengthened by the tonic she brought upon my lips, and I drank full cups of its sweet, rich nectar, which restored my lost hope and renewed my vigour and strength. I looked upon the dull rope I held in my hand with so much less appeal, as my desire for the spirit of death to summon me had all but gone, for it had been blown away by the wind. For why would I want to leave this perfect retreat that energized my heart with a renewed sense of purpose? For I knew that, like the trees, I too also belonged, and come what may, I would live to fight another day. Most people knew the story about Gabriel Harris, who wanted to end it all, but after visiting the forest he came to his senses, because he was bedazzled by the beauty and the energy of the place that brought things to perspective for him, helping him to realize that there was much to live for. So if you feel down or disheartened here in Kentucky, we always talk about the Gabriel Harris cure, and there is one doctor here who recommends it for all patients suffering from depression. Anyway, back to my story. One day a good friend of mine called Bennett popped over to my farm. I could tell by his unsettled, discomposed countenance that he was very bothered and aggrieved by something that was weighing heavily upon his mind. He was clearly in a desperate state, and I realized it was because he had damaged something in one of his father's cars and was terrified that his father would uncover what he'd done. I imagine he had some kind of accident while out joyriding, but I didn't dare to ask too many questions about the matter, as the less I knew, the better as far as I was concerned. Bennett informed me that it would cost over $500 to fix his dad's car. He didn't have that kind of money to cover the repair costs, but if his father found out what he'd done, he would be in a whole heap of trouble. "What are you going to do?" I asked him. "Well, that's why I'm here," he said. "You do have over $500 in your savings account, don't you? You could lend it to me, and I would pay it all back with interest if you like. Please, I'm so desperate." "I've got over $1,000 in my account," I told him, "but I need every penny of it. I can't afford to lend you a thing." "I just want to borrow $500 of it," Bennett assured me. "I'll pay you back in 6 months, I promise." "Why can you not just come clean with your dad and admit what you've done?" I asked. "I mean, what's the worst thing he can possibly do to you?" "Well, how about kill me?" said Bennett. "Put it this way, he'll ground me for an entire month and make my life a living hell. Do you really want that for me? Come on, bro, please help me out." "I'm sorry, Bennett, I don't want to lend you the money, because when I ask for it back, I'm going to become like a monster in your eyes, and then you'll end up hating and despising me, and it will ruin our friendship for good, and I would simply hate that to happen." "Don't be so ridiculous and melodramatic," said Bennett. "That won't happen to us. We'll always be friends." "All right," I said, "but I want you to sign this paper establishing the fact that this is a loan and that you'll be paying me back within 6 months, no later. Do you understand?" "I understand," said Bennett. "You've saved my life, bro. Thank you so much. You truly are a great friend." I remember I didn't feel positive about this loan at all. My father had always warned me that loaning money to friends was not a good idea, because he assured me that no good deed ever goes unpunished. He warned me that when you ask for the money back, the friend invariably ends up resenting you. I was to discover how right he actually was. Months turned into 2 years, and Bennett had still not paid me back, not even a bean. And I was growing increasingly frustrated and overwrought, especially when I discovered he'd come into some money of his own from a grandmother that had since passed. To add insult to injury, Bennett had bought himself a Chrysler Cruiser, putting his own desires above his obligation to pay me back. Enough was enough as far as I was concerned, and I approached Bennett for my money. "Come on, bro," I said to him. "It's been over 2 years now. You've managed to buy yourself a rather swanky car, so you cannot pretend you can't afford to pay me my $500 that you owe me." Bennett became rather incensed. "Look, bro, I have lots of other expenses at the moment. I'll pay you back when I get the cash flow, I promise. At the moment, I'm really strapped for cash." I remember feeling so outraged, affronted and incensed about this whole thing. I knew it was highly improbable that Bennett would ever pay me back. A boy at my school advised me that his uncle, a man called Rod, was a skillful debt collector. If you give him $100 of the money, he'll get Bennett to cough up the $400 for you, in a legal way, he assured me. I was young, naive, gullible and easily manipulated. I also had little experience with debt collectors, and of course the underhanded tactics that they might incorporate or employ in order to get money back from their clients. At this stage I was persuaded that Bennett was not going to pay me back, so $100 loss on $500 didn't seem too bad, and so I agreed to this arrangement. But imagine my appalled disgust when I discovered that Rod had beaten Bennett black and blue, demanding my money back. I mean, this is not an ethical way to ask someone to repay a loan. I was absolutely appalled. "What have you done?" said Bennett, arriving at my farm, looking as if he'd been punnelled through a mince grinder, and he was hobbling around my yard, clearly in a great deal of pain, and one of his eyes was totally black. I felt very ashamed. He continued, "Last night, when I was out on the town having a burger at the diner, I was walking down the street holding my girlfriend's hand when this thuggish, very beefy man, built like an ox, pulled me over onto the street, pounded on me and started beating me up with his powerful fists and demanding me to pay you your $600 back. He said he'd been authorized by you to get your money and all the interest that I owe him. I told you that I would pay you back, bro. What have you done? This dude could have killed me." "I don't know what to say, Bennett. I'm so appalled about what's happened to you. I did hear that the man Rod was a debt collector, and I thought he would legitimately get my money back from you in a legal way. I did not expect him to beat you up like this, nor did I ask him to add on extra money for the hell of it. I'm so sorry. I'll have to sort this out." As you can imagine, I was absolutely incensed and furious by this time, and I quickly phoned up Rod to cancel this whole debt-collecting assignment. "You cannot change your mind on a deal, boy. A deal's a deal as far as I'm concerned. I told you I will get your money back for you, and I will. Tell your friend he owes me $800 now. The price keeps going up. Tick-tock, tick-tock. If he doesn't deliver the goods, he's a dead man." As you can imagine, I couldn't believe what was happening, and I quickly phoned Bennett to tell him what was going on, and that Rod was going to stop at nothing to get the money back and more besides, just to line his own greedy pockets. It was an abysmal, nightmarish situation to find ourselves in. "But I don't have $800, he told me. "What am I going to do? Rod is going to kill me. You've seen what he's like. The guy's a monster." "We could go to the police," I suggested. "What Rod is doing is illegal." "I don't want the police involved," said Bennett. "Don't worry," I told him. "I have a good plan. We'll get Rod to meet you in the forest, and all three of us will hide behind the trees. And when I say three of us, I'm talking about Jordan and Max, who will come along as well. We'll all have our rifles together, and if he tries to beat you up, we'll threaten to shoot him. We'll then talk him around, and if he doesn't cooperate with us, we'll tie up his hands and feet together and put him in the back of your car and take him straight to the police station and accuse him of trying to kill you for money, with all of us as witnesses to back up your statement." "Are you sure it will work?" Bennett asked. "Well, have you got any better suggestions?" I asked. And so it was. We arranged that the forest would be the rendezvous point for Bennett to hand over the $800 to Rod, which of course he didn't have. "Why the forest?" asked Rod, sounding suspicious. "Is this some kind of a set-up, boy? I wasn't born yesterday." "No, of course not," I insisted. "Bennett wants a place where he feels safe, away from the prying eyes of his parents, as he doesn't want them involved in this whole ghastly mess." "Fair enough," said Rod. "So he's got the money, I take it?" "Yes," I said. "Well, you'll only get $300 out of the 8. The rest is mine," said Rod. "I don't do this job for peanuts, you know." I was not about to argue with a man who uses his fists to get exactly what he wants. Fine, I said. It must have been about 10 o'clock that night, when 4 of us stealthily ventured into the forest, wearing our headlamps above our head. I'm glad to say that it wasn't too dark, as the glistening pearly moon was very nearly full, and there was a scattering of silvery stars that afforded us a decent light. It's funny how different the forest feels at night. It really was rather surreal taking up our hiding places behind the various oak trees. "What are we going to do if Rod brings reinforcements?" asked Jordan. "What do we do then?" "Well, if the worst comes to the worst," I said, "we'll have to call the police. But let's hope we can talk Rod around. I don't get the strong impression that he's very bright. He's all muscle, beef and brawn, without much brain, I have to say." "I'm not sure you can actually talk a hooligan like him around," said Jordan reflectively. "Does a leopard ever change its spots? I think not." I remember 100 things were going on in my mind as we all waited on tender hooks for Rod to eventually arrive. Imagine if Jordan was right and Rod brought an aggressive dog along with him, or worse still, a couple of his gangster friends. Maybe they would be brought along for backup. What would we do then? I realised with absolute horror I hadn't actually thought through this plan thoroughly enough, but it was far too late, as Rod would be here any moment. My worst fears were confirmed when we heard the ominous heavy footfall and suddenly saw Rod arriving in the forest, along with 2 heavily built men that looked like mean Rottweilers that were wearing string vests that showed off their powerful, intimidatingly heavily tattooed biceps, along with blue jeans and belts with halties attached, containing pistols. My heart sank as I realised even with our weapons we were no match for these men, who looked so nasty and vindictive that they would not hesitate in a moment to kill us. I was certain of that fact. I quickly indicated for Jordan to call the police on his cell phone, as I knew we were no match for these thugs. Rod swaggered proudly towards Bennett, with a cocky grin upon his face, with his 2 bolstering reinforcements shadowing behind his left and right shoulders like baleful bodyguards. "Where is my $800 that you owe me? I want it now." "I haven't got it here with me," cried Bennett, trembling. "My friend's bringing it over. He'll be here any minute. Just wait a little longer." "Wait for what?" asked Rod. "Have I not waited long enough, boy? I'm growing tired of all your shenanigans. Don't you think I've got better things to do than go chasing after pitiful amounts of money for clients like this? So where's the $800? "My friend will be here any minute," said Bennett, stalling for time. At this, Rod became furiously enraged. He began to violently kick Bennett very, very hard with his leather boots. Bennett let out a gut-wrenching scream because he was in so much agonising pain that literally travelled through the forest like a wild, desperate alarm call. I was so terrified that buckets of sweat were pouring down my forehead. My heart was thundering in my chest like a drum. I quickly wondered should I intervene or not, to protect Bennett, or to wait for the police to arrive. I wasn't sure what to do. I admit I didn't feel confident tackling these intimidating men, and my courage dissipated and was vanquished by an overwhelming, crippling fear. What if the police didn't get here in time? I was almost certain that Rod would kick Bennett to death, and it would all be my fault. I'd got us into this dreadful mess. All of a sudden we could hear this thunderous commotion that sounded like a rhino racing through the thicket at a hell of a speed. It was a terrifying noise, but I noticed Rod was so caught up in kicking Bennett and seemed to be enjoying torturing the boy that he didn't hear anything at all, which was extraordinary. Bennett was yelping like a frightened puppy, with his body now on the forest floor, with Rod's heavy boots thrust upon him. The next thing that happened is so extraordinarily surreal, for help arrived for us in the nick of time from a very unusual, unlikely source, in a manner we could never have anticipated in our wildest dreams or greatest imaginings. For suddenly, hurling its overlong arms around Rod, was no other than the legendary creature known as Bigfoot. He stood erect and proud upon his 2 tree-trunk-sized legs, at about 10 feet off the ground, and 3 feet in width across the upper shoulders. I think the thing that stunned me the most was the colossal size of this Bigfoot. It was like being in the presence of a mighty beast, rather like King Kong, as it was every inch as burly as it was muscular, and was covered in long, wavy, dark, glorious hair. It possessed a pyramid-shaped head that seemed to mould into its shoulders without any neck. The creature possessed a very human-like face, although the features did appear to be obscured as the light was not that good. It was easy to discern that the Bigfoot was visibly upset. He seemed to perceive what was happening through his very intelligent, discerning eyes. He observed poor Bennett lying curled up in a fetal position on the ground, trying desperately to protect himself from the blows he was receiving from Rod's heavy boots. He was covering his head and eyes with his hands and arms, and was whimpering. The Bigfoot sensed that Rod was the aggressor and the perpetrator, and immediately came to his rescue. When Rod saw the Bigfoot, his eyes were astonished. They grew as wide as saucers, and his mouth dropped open in surprise, for even next to the Bigfoot, he looked puny and pathetic by contrast. Rod began to fiddle desperately with the firearm in his holty, but the Bigfoot lunged towards him, grabbed him around the waist, and hurled him in the air several times, as if he was catching a frisbee. Rod was screaming, "Shoot him! Shoot him!" to his friends, who were too petrified to take on the magnificent beast, and instead of assisting their friend, they ran away like two frightened rabbits. They were indeed fair-weather friends, concerned only in saving their own skins, and certainly not Rod's. Finally, the Bigfoot just tossed Rod over his shoulders with a look of disgusted revulsion upon his face, as if he was throwing out a stinking piece of garbage. I watched in stupefied awe as Rod's body flip-flopped backwards in a dodgy-looking somersault and precariously landed on the ground. We could hear that unfavourable snapping sound of Rod's neck, and we knew immediately that he must be dead. The magnanimous Bigfoot glanced at Bennett briefly. His eyes looked so gentle and kind, and Bennett visibly relaxed because he sensed he was now safe. In that moment we were not afraid, as we were all eyewitnesses to the astonishing kindness shown in this tender-hearted, benevolent Bigfoot's eyes. We all knew in that instant that the creature had graciously come to our rescue when he had heard Bennett's frantic cries. We could now hear police sirens as they rushed into the woods, but by then the Bigfoot had long since glided away. To cut a long story short, the police falsely believed that Rod had been killed by a bear, and we let them believe that erroneous story. We were never ever going to tittle-tattle on the gallant, amiable Bigfoot that put an end to Rod's duplicitous behaviour. I'm sorry to say, but I have no sympathy for Rod and the likes of people like him. As far as I'm concerned, anyone that exploits other people for his own ends cannot be described as human. In the end, I did get my money back from Bennett, but I gave it all to charity. It had become contaminated, in my opinion, by this whole grievous incident. I think the moral of my story is to never lend money if you want it back. It's not worth souring a friendship over a loan. So if you cannot afford not to get your money back, then don't lend it in the first place. That's my firm opinion. This incident with the Bigfoot happened about 5 or 6 years ago. My advice to anybody is if you're in trouble in a forest, call out for help. You never know who might come to your aid. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Claudia and I grew up in a beautiful country home in close proximity to the charming, very cosy mountain town of Kethum, with my grown-up half-sister Gladys, who was my father's daughter from a previous marriage, and my younger brother Gerald. Kethum is situated very close to Sun Valley Resort in Idaho, long revered for its phenomenal and exciting ski slope areas at Bald Mountain, and of course the more gentle slopes at Dollar Mountain. Sun Valley is home to the world's first chairlift that was installed on Dollar and Proctor Mountain in 1936, which puts Sun Valley on the map as a ski resort. Our area is filled with miles upon miles of glorious mountain trails, equestrian routes, and wildflower-filled meadows, ablaze with all manner of pretty flowers in mauves, pinks, and purples and blues. There are very well-marked trails from town offering pathways up Proctor Mountain for spectacular views over the glorious valleys. Growing up in this part of the world was an extreme privilege because you're surrounded by so much incredible beauty, and I hope I have never taken it for granted, as from an early age, hiking, fishing, riding, mountain biking, exploring, camping and horse riding were a quintessential part of our lives. My mother worked as a doctor in town locally, and my father was recruited to take tourists on horse riding trails around the Kethum area. He invariably told us the most phenomenal stories of all kinds of amazing people he met from all over the globe, like Sweden, Norway, Australia and Africa. Many of our visitors preferred Kethum to places like Aspen because they said it was so much more relaxed here, less ostentatious, snooty or showy, and much more spread out. Without wishing to be biased, I really believe our ski slopes are superb, and they're always so well groomed and maintained for all our guests who come here to ski. People also enjoy visiting this part of the world in summer for the hiking, exploring, horse riding and fishing opportunities. Our symmetrical whitewashed farmhouse is nestled in an idyllic, awe-inspiring setting, flanked by statuesque mountains at the rear and quaking aspen trees on its right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, there is a large field of sagebrush that eventually opens out into a heavily wooded area, where there are tiny little streams of gushing water that meander through this woodland stretch, filled with crystal clear, sparkling water. My first ever experience with a Bigfoot happened in 1998, when I was about 8 years old, and Gerald, my brother, was about 7. It was my older sister Gladys's responsibility to take care of us while my parents were out working, but Gladys did not know the meaning of the word responsibility, and she failed at her childcare duties abysmally. At 17 years old, she was always on the phone giggling and joking with her boyfriend, and was easily distracted, so much so that we could pretty much do what we liked without Gladys even batting an eyelid or even noticing a single thing. Without wishing to be nasty, Gladys was quite unequivocally the world's worst babysitter. Her inability to notice what we got up to meant that we had free rein to do almost anything that we wanted. On one occasion, my brother and I used our acrylic paints to paint pictures all over our bedroom walls of ducks and fish and houses and people, and Gladys tried to cover the evidence up for my parents by claiming that we hadn't painted the murals under her watch, and so, of course, it wasn't her fault. One day, while Gladys was otherwise preoccupied, my brother and I had run through the sagebrush and were chasing each other around the wooded area, screaming with delight at the top of our lungs with words like, "You can't catch me! Catch me if you can!" I remember I was running away from my brother along the trail across a little rocky pool of water from the stream. I slipped over some jagged rocks, falling very hard on my knees, and I began to howl like a baby because it hurt so very much. I admit in those days I was a huge wimp. All of a sudden, this very large bear ran out of the woods towards me and immediately lifted me out of the puddle, bending over to study my grazed knees, where the skin had broken and it was bleeding. I was gladdened and chuffed by the attention that the bear was devoting to my grievous injury, and she was so much nicer than Gladys would ever have been. My sister would have reacted with so little sympathy and would have probably told me to stop being such a great big baby and to go and get a plaster for myself. However, this nice bear was making such a fuss over me and was so attentive to my injury. She whistled while she began washing the blood off my graze from the spring water in the puddle. I was amazed that the bear had a human-like face and bright brown eyes that looked at me warmly, as if to say, "I'm going to make it all better for you." I stopped crying immediately and just stared at her with wide, curious eyes. And before long my brother had joined us in a nonchalant way, as if meeting a bear like this was perfectly normal. I think he was also enamoured and enthralled to see the bear fussing over us, as for a child an oversized walking teddy bear was not beyond the realms of impossibility, or the paradoxical, as we were open to believing in things that adults would dismiss as fictitious or inconceivable. For as small children, there were no boundaries between the world of fairy tales and the natural world, as we were open to strange, infeasible experiences that we considered normal, for in our childlike reality there were no limitations. The very nice bear glided away for a moment, returning with some leaves which she rubbed on my bloodied gash, and I remember the pain just dissipated like magic, and I began to giggle. "It doesn't hurt any more," I said happily. The bear then very methodically and skillfully placed a few leaves over my injury, and wound some twine around my knee to make a makeshift bandage. I remember thinking it was so cool to have a bandage made from leaves. Gerald became so begrudgingly jealous that I had a leafy green bandage and he did not, so he began to cry bitterly because it wasn't fair as far as he was concerned. The bear seemed to understand his sorry plight and immediately gave him a bandage on his knee as well, and we proudly returned home with our leaved plasters tied together with twine, hobbling along as if we were in pain, hoping to draw attention to ourselves and to our fabulous plasters. As to be expected, Gladys was otherwise preoccupied, so much so that she barely noticed our bandaged knees. She was so wrapped up and engrossed with talking to a friend of hers on the phone. I never understood why my big sister would talk to her boyfriend and then phone her girlfriend to tell her everything her boyfriend had said to her on the phone, as if analysing the conversation through a microscope. It never made any sense to me at all. My big sister was very strange as far as I was concerned. When my parents were away, it was like Gladys became superglued to that telephone. But when my mother returned from work, she acted as if she had been babysitting and watching over us intently. Gladys knew how to pull the wool over my parents' eyes with her guileful techniques of persuasion. My mother would thank her profusely for taking such great care of us and promptly reward her with a huge wad of cash for all her trouble. On this occasion it was my mother that asked us why we had leaves on our knees tied together with twine, and my sister interceded and said we'd been playing a game of doctors and nurses together. Gladys would lie with the straightest face on her, and my mother never doubted her word. I promptly told my mother that it was a bear in the woods that had attended to our wounds, and not Gladys, and my mother laughed. "That's very nice, dear," she said. "It must have been a very nice bear." She then turned around to Gladys and said, "You never cease to amaze me, Gladys, how adventurous you are with the children. I like the leaf bandage idea. It's such a creative touch, and awfully imaginative of you. You are clever." "Well, I've always been creative with kids," said Gladys. "When the cat's away, the mouse will most certainly play, and once my parents were out of the way, you could bet that my sister Gladys was almost always caught up with her boyfriend issues, which was so common as she attracted drama in her life like a bee to a honeypot. I always remember her conversations went something like this. "I never told her you were a loser. She was lying to you. I think she's just jealous because we've been together for 6 whole months. No, I promise you I'm not lying. Of course I like you." Then we would hear her on the phone reprimanding her girlfriend. "Why did you tell him I said he was a loser?" "Of course I like him. I was just having a bad day, that's all. Why did you have to tell him that?" My brother and I would stealthily sneak past my sister in the entrance hall and run through the sagebrush towards the wooded area to see if we could see the bear with the human face, and we were rarely ever disappointed. We would sit by the stream while the creature would play with our hair, braiding it into hundreds of tiny braids and tying the ends up with twine. My brother and I adored it when she played with our hair, as it was like having a head massage. It was so relaxing. As the bear braided our hair, she whistled lovely tunes to us that incorporated bird tweets and warbles, and you would literally have believed you were listening to a vast range of birds in the forest. Sometimes if we heard a bird tweet, she would copy the bird exactly and try and teach us to do the same. She could imitate a coyote, a dog, an owl, a turkey and a pig to perfection. She was brilliant. We both taught her to say our names, which she did with little difficulty. When we asked her what her name was, she pointed to the acorns, so we called her Acorn. I assure you that after spending hours in the wooded area with Acorn, when we did eventually return home, Gladys was still in the entrance hall, on the phone, and hadn't even noticed that we had gone missing. When my mother saw our hair braided in hundreds of braids, she was exceedingly impressed with Gladys for spending so much time playing with us, and once again applauded my sister for her patience, and ended up giving her more money for her trouble. When my brother and I were older, we didn't really see our bear friend Acorn anymore. Obviously by then we had realised with the advantage of maturity that she wasn't a bear, and considered that she was like a human that was covered in hair. Life seemed to march forward very fast at a rapid pace in those early years, as we got so caught up in all our schoolwork and extracurricular activities after school. I would take ballet and art and swimming classes, while my brother did judo and gymnastics. There was less time to spend in the wooded area on our land, and it would seem we were distracted by friends' birthday parties and all kinds of other activities. When we were free, my brother and I would go riding together over the countryside on our 2 family horses, as by then we had become passionate horse riders. We were exposed to some fantastic riding trails out here in Kethum, and my father taught us to become accomplished riders. One day on one of our horse riding adventures, which invariably were always marvellously enjoyable, as we loved trotting through the panoramic landscape and feasting our eyes upon the quintessential marvels of the natural world, which we never ceased to applaud and appreciate. On this particular occasion, my brother and I were casually talking together as we trotted through a flowery meadow, taking a swift shortcut towards the horse trail that was lined with quaking aspen trees. I remember we were talking about who I would be inviting to my 16th birthday party in June that year. Saxon Rose was my bay and black Morgan horse, and although beautiful, she was exceedingly temperamental and would easily get spooked. On this particular occasion, some silver air balloons had got caught up in the quaking aspen trees that were whistling in the breeze, causing the silvery, sparkling balloons to whip around the branches very precariously, making a beating, rustling sound that was at the very least very unsettling for the horses. Saxon Rose became so frantic that she began to buck and backtrack on her steps, turning around where she whipped back across the meadow from whence we'd formerly come, like a bucking bronco, and despite being a proficient rider, I was seemingly unable to control her frenzied panic. Before I knew it, I was being flung off her back violently, landing on the grassy meadow below. But although I was fine, I appeared to have twisted my ankle rather badly, as it had got caught up in the stirrups during the fall. I was groaning in agony as the pain was shooting through my foot, and I lay on the ground, realising in horror that I couldn't walk on my painful ankle. It was swelling up quite significantly. Needless to say, Saxon Rose, who had been trembling with fear and extremely skittish and overwrought, was not waiting for anyone at all, and had galloped off home, leaving me there stranded in the field. My brother, having realised what had just transpired, told me to stay put while he went back to get help. But imagine our surprise when our old friend Acorn made a sudden, unexpected appearance. We could hear her thundering through the grass towards us. We were so delighted to see her. It was amazing because after all these years she still had remembered our names. She looked at me and said, "Claudia," and began examining my leg. She pulled me up by my arm, raising me on my feet with her large hands and trying to encourage me to walk, but I barely managed to hobble. Acorn grabbed a bunch of petals from a nearby flowering plant and began rubbing the petals over the swelling, and it was very soothing. I do remember salty tears were pouring down my cheeks, not because I was in pain, but because I was so thrilled to see Acorn again. I realised how much I'd missed her, how long it had been, and seeing her brought back nostalgic memories of my early life. My brother was climbing down his horse, and I could tell he was choking up with emotions to see Acorn again as well. I could tell he was trying hard not to show his feelings, but he was not succeeding in hiding how thrilled he was to see our old friend. He embraced Acorn by giving her a friendly, informal pat on the back, although I think he would secretly rather have given her a hug. But getting older had made him less effusive and much more restrained and wary of showing his feelings. Acorn was so pleased to see the both of us and started whistling happily like the good old days. It was funny because my brother's horse, Airborne Magic, was not remotely spooked by Acorn at all, despite the fact that she was covered in hair and so very large in size. Acorn indicated for my brother to ride back home on Airborne Magic, while she threw me over her shoulders like a sack of oranges, and trotted diligently alongside his horse at the very same speed, without getting remotely out of breath, and the ride was smoother on her than it had been on Saxon Rose. I was amazed because Acorn was naturally shy, reticent and self-effacing, but she courageously carried me back to the house, delivering me promptly outside the kitchen door, with the awkward risk of being seen by my parents, which she was eager to avoid. I reached out and gave her a huge hug, but of course with Acorn being so large, I could barely get my arms around her very sizable barrel-shaped chest. Nevertheless, it was a good hug. I remember I had to rest up for several days before my sprained ankle eventually healed, but after Acorn's savvy application of those pressed flowers, the swelling went down in my ankles very swiftly. Ironically, shortly after encountering Acorn again, my brother and I began to watch programs on television all about an elusive North American creature known as Bigfoot, and we quickly discerned that Acorn was in fact a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. From what we could fathom, we were incredibly lucky to have such personal interaction with one of these creatures that we looked upon as a friend. Many people on the television were describing Sasquatches as very smelly, but Acorn did not smell bad at all. In fact, I know of people that smell much more pungent than she ever did, in particular a girl at school that stunk to high heaven after sports games. I think Acorn smelt rather like a domestic house cat that's been rolling around in the dust and dirt on the driveway. You can smell the earth on her fur. I would describe it as an earthy smell, really rather like that. We also heard that people were terrified of Sasquatches or Bigfoot, which surprised us as we didn't find Acorn at all scary. But then we decided that on reflection, Acorn was probably quite scary to look at. It's just that we knew that she wasn't a scary creature, so we didn't perceive her like that. Think about it, said my brother. Acorn is massive and covered in hair. Imagine if you didn't know her like we do, you would think you were being approached by a monster. I suppose you're right, I said. I hadn't thought of it like that. One day on the neighbouring farm adjacent to our home, Mr. Livingston, a farmer who'd been a friend of our family's over many long years, decided to cut down a vast woodland area with the full intention of bulldozing and flattening the land to create a substantial clearing so that they could build holiday cabins for tourists visiting Kethum, as the tourism industry was booming, and it was an excellent way to secure extra income. It would seem the moment that Mr. Livingston workers began felling the trees on the land, the tree fellers were continuously handing in their notice and refusing to work on the site. But they weren't willing to elaborate on their stories and seemed rather cagey about the incidents and unwilling to talk about why they had randomly chosen to throw in their notices. "I've never heard so many crazy excuses in all my life," Mr. Livingston complained. "I'm just asking your men to cut down a grove of trees, and they're making a mountain out of a molehill about the job. Why is everyone giving in their notice all of a sudden? I don't understand. It's completely crazy. You need to hang around on site with my men and see what's going on with them," suggested the manager of the project. "Something doesn't want us to take down those trees, and it's giving my men a very hard time. My men have families to support, but they're not prepared to put their necks on the line for a job like yours. It's not worth their while." Farmer Livingston thought the men were making pathetic, unreasonable excuses, but he soon changed his mind when he began assisting one of the tree fellers in taking down a tree, as a huge rock came flying in his direction, missing him by centimetres. He was outraged and appalled by this incident, as he knew that he could have potentially been seriously injured. The workers admitted that they had felt threatened and intimidated by a couple of very angry Bigfoot on the site, who had been screaming at them and throwing rocks. The men were terrified and didn't want to continue with their jobs, but had been embarrassed to admit that the Bigfoots had been their contentious issue. When my brother and I heard about the trouble that Farmer Livingston was having on his farm with a couple of very aggressive Bigfoot, we decided to pay him an impromptu visit. We knew that Acorn was a Bigfoot, and she would never ever intentionally hurt anyone, so there had to be a very good reason that the Bigfoots didn't want the tree felling to proceed. "Hello, Mr. Livingston," I said. "We've heard all about your troubles with Bigfoot, and we came along to see if we could help." "You've heard about my problems, have you?" said Mr. Livingston. "Well, what am I going to do? No one wants to take down these trees of mine. The tree fellers simply refuse to work. I've had such huge plans for the cabins that I wanted to build here. and my dream is all coming apart at the seams. It would seem I have a couple of savage Bigfoot on my land who are intent on causing grievous harm to the workers and scaring them half to death. Well, maybe there's a good reason they don't want you to build the cabins here, I told Farmer Livingston. My brother and I personally know a Bigfoot living in these parts called Acorn. Granted, she is big and scary looking and covered in long dark brown hair. I'd say she's easily 800 pounds and 8 foot tall and possibly even 3 foot wide, but she hasn't got a mean bone in her body. I can promise you of that. If her kind are lashing out at your men, there has to be a good reason for it, because they are by nature benevolent and evasive. So much so, in fact, that we don't even know the members of Acorn's family. That's how quiet and shy these creatures usually are. Acorn's always been friendly towards us, but she befriended us when we were very young, and I think that makes a difference. Farmer Livingston looked at me with a befuddled expression on his face. "You mean you're friends with a Bigfoot?" he said, looking absolutely appalled. "If I had my way, I would kill the whole lot of them. Do your parents know about this?" "Absolutely not," I said, "and I would never tell them either, because they would never understand such an incongruous friendship." "Well, maybe you can find out for me why these Bigfoot are causing me so much grief. It's despicable that these creatures are trying to harm my workers." "We'll try to find out what's going on," I assured him. "Last time I saw Acorn was about 2 months ago, after I fell off my horse, and she helped me get back home safely. My brother and I will call her and see if she comes to us, as she knows her name. But she may not be there, because Bigfoots do move around from place to place all the time." When my brother and I returned home, we ventured out to the wooded area on our land, where we'd first encountered Acorn when we were very small, and we called out her name. Imagine our incredible surprise when we could hear Acorn's heavy footfall, along with her familiar whistling, and we knew she had answered our call. I was so happy to see her again that I hugged her impulsively, and she looked thrilled to see us as well. And then I pointed to Farmer Livingston's farm and began to mime men taking down trees and having stones hurled at them by her people. I could see that Acorn knew exactly what I was saying, and she became animated and frustrated because she couldn't articulate what she wanted to say in words. She began to draw vigorously in the ground, and from what I could discern by her drawings, she was saying that generations of Bigfoot were buried in those woods, and they didn't want the graves of their people decimated. When my brother and I went to visit Mr. Livingston, we told him what Acorn had revealed to us about the wooded area on his property, and we were surprised by his generous reaction. "Now I understand," he said, stroking his moustache thoughtfully. "I will not build the cabins on a burial ground. That would be sacrilege. And besides, I'm superstitious about such things. No good ever came from digging up grave sites, as even the land does not thank you for it. It's all about the energy, you know. I have a greater respect for these Bigfoot, for it seems that they have human emotions. For indeed, if someone were digging up my dead ancestors and wanting to build cabins over their resting places, I would possibly also start throwing stones at the offender in much the same way. I do get it, you know." "So you're not going to build your cabins there?" I asked in amazement. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Livingston, on behalf of all the Bigfoot. I really believe they'll appreciate your sensitivity to this matter." "Of course I understand, Claudia," piped Farmer Livingston. "I have too much respect for the dead, I really do. I know an old friend of mine who built properties over a cemetery. Biggest mistake of his life, and no good ever came from that endeavour. I gather he disturbed the graves and relocated their bones, and then he built the new development there. I learnt that those houses were perpetually haunted, and people who lived there all died in mysterious circumstances. Finally, a fire broke out mysteriously and burnt down all the houses to the ground. The land didn't even want the buildings there, and some people even said that the land groaned." "Well, I can see why you've changed your mind," I said. "That's certainly quite a story." We were so thrilled to hear that Mr. Livingston decided to build the cabins on one of his open meadows, which was a far better idea anyway. He never had any problems with angry Sasquatch after that. One day he even informed us that he'd received dozens of pretty gemstones on his doorstep, which he believed were a gift from the Bigfoot, thanking him for his kindness in abandoning the project. I really sensed that Mr. Livingston had a healthy new respect for the creature. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nathan and I'm from the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, which is a mid-Atlantic northeastern state in the Appalachian region of the United States, with Harrisburg as the state capital. Pennsylvania is long revered for its rich, vibrant history, incredible rich culture, and very picturesque scenery, with over 100 miles of gorgeous coastline and 120 state parks. I grew up here in the 1980s with my parents and my younger sister Nicola in a beautiful farm in close proximity to a quaint, very charming old-world town where the local population was very warm and friendly. We knew almost everybody in those days, and as is the case in any small town, it was not short of its eccentric, quirky characters. One of those rather remarkable, unique characters was a woman called Doris Collymore, who at one time had been a rather reserved, reticent, demure woman, but that soon changed rather dramatically in 1975 after she had the most horrific car accident where she had to be removed from the gnarled, dented and twisted metal with the jaws of life. As her car was a complete write-off, it was so badly crushed and rather resembled an inverted oyster shell. I gather that even the fire chief at the time had said it was impossible to believe that anybody could survive such a devastating wreck. Doris died for over 5 minutes, but the EMTs continued to pump at her chest very vigorously, breaking a few ribs in the process. Yet miraculously they did manage to bring Doris back from the brink of death. Ever since Doris had returned from the other side, so to speak, she had become exceedingly sensitive and psychic, so much so that it was almost scary to be in her presence. She described herself as a clairsentient, which is the ability to know and sense things past, present and future, and to feel the presence of spirit. I was to learn that the secret revelatory knowledge of hers was experienced in the stomach area or gut, and not in her head, as you might expect. I get these terrible knots in my stomach, she told me, and then I just know things. Many people describe Doris as like a hawk because she was tall and lanky, with an exceedingly long pointed nose that looked disproportionately large on her rather small angular face, and dark beady eyes. I remember on one occasion she randomly stopped my mother in the street and told her that she should give her father a call. "I sense he'd like to hear from you," she told my mother in a casual, nonchalant way. "If I were you, I'd give him a call tonight." My mother phoned her father that evening, and the following morning he was announced dead, as he died of a heart attack. So my mother was eternally grateful to Doris that she had been able to speak to him for one last time. On one occasion Doris said to the butcher, "You need to look after that ticker of yours, or it'll be the death of you." And a week later the butcher had had a heart attack and came very close to losing his life. After that scary event, the butcher subsequently lost weight, took up physical exercise, and became a vegan, which was rather ironic since he sold prime cuts of beef to all the locals. Since when have you ever heard of a vegan butcher? But stranger things have happened in our small town. Ever since Doris had become psychic, she had started up a little business from home, which she called the Whispers of Truth. She did not charge much for you to see her, and if you couldn't afford a session, she would waive the fee completely. "I only charge if so that I can afford to pay my bills," she told us once. "If I had my way, I wouldn't charge you a penny." In our town, Doris was always booked up, and people in the neighbouring towns had heard about her remarkable gift and would travel far and wide just to see her. People testified to her accuracy. This is very significant to my story. Growing up, my sister Nicola and I were inseparable. I'm not sure why, but we just connected on every single level, and I was very devoted and protective of her as my younger sister. We lived in a very traditional vintage-style colonial farmhouse where we were surrounded by undulating green turf, pretty meadows, a lovely creek, and a vast area of natural forest full of hemlocks, cedars, maples and dogwoods. And as young children, we loved nothing better than exploring those woods. For us it was like escaping to a whole new, magical world, much like the children in The Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe. We likened this enchanting verdant wonderland to the indelible treasured story. It was like our little enthralling sanctuary, away from the farmhouse which we called the Little Pixie Grove. I will say this, though, about the Little Pixie Grove, and that is that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this exquisite woodland area was notoriously haunted, as my sister and I had atmospheric, wistful experiences there that we will never, ever forget. It was on a spring afternoon when we were playing in the woods by the little silvery creek, where my sister and I sensed we were not alone. We both discerned what I can only describe as a menacing, foreboding, prodigious presence that caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. It's very hard to explain how that feels, but you sense you're not alone, and someone spectral or preternatural is watching you. But what my sister and I were clearly experiencing was completely abnormal. All of a sudden we heard a disembodied man's phlegmy cough, and then we could hear footfall moving ominously towards us with purposeful intent, and walking through the puddles of water, lifting them up with a little splash here and there, and we saw this ourselves, but there was nothing there. "Run!" I screamed to my sister. "Run!" The next thing I knew was that Nicola fell over in her haste to flee, and she raised herself off the ground with a face that was as white as a sheet, and eyes that were round with terror. "Something pushed me over," she cried. "I could feel these icy cold hands on my back." I could see she was trembling from the shock, but she hurriedly raised her body off the ground, and we began to run together, and I held her hands to stop her from falling over again. The next thing I knew was that I felt a cold, vaporous breath being blown on my neck, and I could smell the rancid odour of gin. That was when I heard a menacing whisper blowing directly in my ear, and a man's raspy voice saying, "I've got you, boy." At that moment I was violently hurled to the ground, and something physical was holding me down with a brute force. My sister describes me as physically kicking and fighting something that could not be physically discerned, but I promise you I could feel the solid weight of a heavy man punching me violently. All of a sudden the ghostly being let go of me, and Nicola and I just bolted back to the farmhouse as fast as we possibly could, and I discovered that I had dark bruises all over my body where I had been physically punched, and my sister's back exposed the impression of a huge hand imprint where she claimed to have been pushed. We never told anybody about our outlandish, rather ludicrous experience because it was so weird and seemingly unbelievable. I will say this, however, one night my father ventured into the Little Pixie Grove as he had seen a flashing luminescent light flickering in the trees, and he felt drawn to follow it. As he got ever closer, he saw a very heavily built man wearing 1800s workman's clothes with rolled-up sleeves, dangling from a tree branch with a rope over his neck, and he said it gave him the chills. He said the hangman was there for a moment, and then he wasn't. It certainly put us off venturing into the Little Pixie Grove for quite a while, but we could not keep out of our special place for very long. One day when I was 20 years old, I went to stay in Hampshire in England for a couple of years with an uncle of mine, who was my father's brother, who finally emigrated to England to marry his English wife. He was willing to teach me all I needed to know about dairy farming, so I went off to live with him on his farm, and it was an opportunity of a lifetime that I simply could not afford to miss, and have never regretted. While I was in England, my sister kept writing to me every single week, and I missed her terribly, because we were so incredibly close. I unequivocally regarded her as my very best friend. One day I remember being so shocked when she wrote to me to tell me that she'd got married. Her letter read the following: "Dearest Nathan, this letter is going to come as a shock or a bolt out of the blue to you, as yesterday afternoon I got married to the young man I told you about, that I'd been dating for a while, called Pierre Graham, who is French-Canadian. You see, I discovered I was pregnant, and Pierre persuaded me to get married to him in secret, which is what I did. It was a gloomy, oppressive day with dark clouds hanging in the sky, and after we tied the knot it poured with rain, and I got completely soaked to the skin. I was not even wearing anything particularly special on that occasion. I just wore that old flowery dress of mine, you know, the one with the pink flowers that you think is terribly pretty. Well, we managed to find a random toilet cleaner on site, who reluctantly agreed to witness our wedding, and luckily she carried flowers in her hand and not her toilet brush. Sorry, I couldn't resist the rather dirty humour. It wasn't what I would have wanted for my big day that every girl always dreams about, but I guess beggars can't be choosers. Worse still, I'm not particularly fond of Pierre. I can't see myself ever actually falling in love with him, so I'm beginning to seriously regret being so recklessly impetuous and impulsive. In truth, I doubt whether I even like him at all. As you can imagine, Mum and Dad weren't at all amused with my flighty, foolhardy decision to get married without them being included in the ceremony. I got the distinct impression that they felt rather affronted, resentful, and piqued by the matter. I can sense their disgruntled disfavour towards Pierre, and I think they may have guessed that I'm pregnant, but I never said a word. Dad told me that we could live in the cottage on his farm, and we're moving in tomorrow. I'm glad to be close to home, I have to say. On a short shopping trip into town the other day, would you believe it, I bumped into Doris Collymore of all people, and she stopped me, still in my tracks, and went as white as a sheet. It wasn't a good look. She looked so startled and said, "You've just got married, haven't you?" I could see her glancing directly at my belly. I'm telling you, Nathan, she knew I'd got married and that I was pregnant. Now how's that even possible, as no one in town knew about my shotgun wedding? That woman is incredible. She's got one hell of a psychic gift, let me tell you. She looked at me with concern on her face and told me to be careful of that husband of mine. "Watch your back," she said. It sent chills down my spine. No one wants Doris to say something like that to them. It doesn't leave you with a pleasant taste in your mouth. I do hope that my husband Pierre isn't going to turn out to be a monster after all, given what Doris just said. We'll be writing back soon. Miss you so very much. Your loving sister. I was mortified and distressed to receive this letter, as I'd never envisaged my sister marrying a man that she didn't love simply because she was pregnant. That was ludicrous. If I'd been at home, I would have persuaded her not to make such a hasty decision. I became very disquieted and troubled when I did not hear from my sister for 4 whole months, and then finally I received a letter from her. Little did I realise that this would be the last letter that I would ever receive from her. It read the following. "Dearest Nathan, how much I miss you so terribly. I so wish you were here to bandage up my open wounds, for I am a very broken woman of late. I've been going through the dark night of the soul, so to speak. Sadly, I lost my baby due to a dreadful miscarriage, and my life is being overwhelmed by a huge sense of unmistakable loss, grief, and hopeless despondency that losing a baby invariably brings. I never realised how much I was actually looking forward to her arrival in this world until she was eclipsed from my life so unexpectedly. I do not believe I ever felt such a heartbroken emptiness before, like a huge irredeemable hollow in my life that simply cannot be filled. The first warning sign that something was wrong was when I woke up in the morning with a desire for a cup of coffee, as I had not been able to stomach the drink since I fell pregnant. A couple of hours later, I realised that I was spotting blood, and so I was booked in for a routine checkup and was informed by the gynecologist that no heartbeat could be detected and that my baby was dead. Since the baby died, I've seen my husband in a brand new light. I can assure you that he is a narcissistic personality type, for he cares not for my well-being or happiness and has already expressed his misgivings in marrying me in the first place. He tirelessly complains that I deliberately trapped him into marriage, which is not true, by falling pregnant, and grievously regrets greatly that we ever tied the knot. He seems to forget that he was the one that persuaded me to take the leap of faith, upon which I now bitterly regret. In my desolate depression and loneliness, I took a long walk in the little elf grove. As strange as it sounds, it was nostalgic for me to walk in the shaded retreat, and it indeed conjured up many delightful memories and flashbacks of our idyllic childhood spent with you, and all the fun we had together playing in the woods. Oh, how I miss the days where responsibilities did not weigh down heavily on our hearts, and we were not duty-bound to please no one but ourselves. Our only pressure was to get home for dinner. How much less complicated our lives were back then. While I was walking in the grove and thinking longingly about you, I ventured towards the silvery creek and saw what I thought was a bear standing upright as straight as an arrow in the shallow end of the water. on two powerful muscular legs. I remember thinking that bears did not stand up this straight with such perpendicular deportment, as this bear was so incredibly graceful, and grace is not really a word that I would acquaint with a bear. I stood still for a moment watching the bear, and felt no sense of anguish at all. Just increased curiosity for the animal held my undivided attention. It was then that the bear lifted one arm up over his shoulder to scratch the upper part of his back, and his arm was so long he had no trouble reaching the insufferable itch he was clearly longing to scratch. I could hear the bear grunting with pleasure as he scratched his back, and that was when I noticed he possessed human-like hands with very fleshy fingers, with flat nail beds just like ours. As you can imagine, I thought I must be losing my mind, for when did a bear ever have hands? That was when I saw her. Maybe she sensed that I was watching her, because very suddenly the bear's head swiveled around in much the same way as an owl does, and that was when our eyes locked. Nathan, I couldn't believe what I was discerning, for this creature was so human, and the face was like that of a woman, very feminine, almost pretty, with high cheekbones, a flat nose, and golden eyes that were full of kindness. The creature then turned around and walked directly towards me with confidence, and she stopped 2 feet away from where I was standing and continued to study me. I promise you, Nathan, she regarded me intently, in much the same way that you might study a painting done by Picasso in an art museum. I know it may sound odd, but it had the look that you might sometimes get from Doris Collymore. I describe it as a look of knowing. It was as if the creature was actually reading my energy, or possibly even my thoughts, but I couldn't really be sure about that. But I promise you this, Nathan, I should have been terribly afraid and intimidated by this hair-covered creature because it was colossal, and I can only describe her as a wild woman. There was something so gentle and agreeable about her countenance, which made me not feel at all afraid. I think she was easily 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, and very muscular, especially upon the shoulder area, with very small breasts. I perceived her head was shaped rather like a cone, and it folded into the shoulders in a gentle sweep, and I don't think I discerned a neck, so to speak, which is why I think she moved her head rather like an owl. The wild woman beckoned for me to follow her, and so I did, and she began to gather some leaves and roots for me. I could tell she wanted me to eat these ingredients, as strange as that sounds, and she picked them for me, and she kept pointing to my belly, as if she knew I'd lost a baby. Now how could she have known that? The creature squatted down while she encouraged me to eat the leaves, and some did not taste very pleasant, but the effect they had on me was tremendous and miraculous. In an instant the heaviness was lifted off my life, and Nathan, I felt as if this black cloud of depression had completely dissipated. I've never ever taken a medicine that had such positive miraculous benefits on me both emotionally and physically. Sadly, the wild woman had to leave, for she pointed towards the rocky crags, where I imagined she must live. I watched her glide away deeper in the woods, and I have to say I didn't want her to go. I do not know where she comes from exactly, but in that moment she had saved me from myself, for my mood was elevated, and I felt as if I'd gained some sort of control over my life again. I realised that I had allowed Pierre to dominate me, but things were about to change. So when I returned home, I told him I wanted a divorce, and he was astonished by my bold announcement and assertiveness. He was very aggrieved by my suggestion, and told me to reconsider my mind. You see why I need you around, brother dearest. If you'd been here, I would never have married the man in the first place. What on earth was I thinking? Much love, your sister Nicola. It was within a week of receiving this letter that I flew back to America, as my parents informed me that Pierre had filed a missing persons report and claimed that Nicola had seemingly never returned home and vanished into thin air. I knew that Nicola would never willingly vanish on her own accord, and when I visited Pierre, he appeared evasive towards me and avoided any kind of eye contact during our whole conversation. He claimed that Nicola had never asked for a divorce, and that they had been happily married, but he did not look like a grieving widow to me. I don't know where she's gone, he told me. Maybe she's been abducted by someone. You hear of these mysterious cases all the time. I think that's extremely unlikely, I said. Well, I don't know what's happened to her, said Pia, slamming the door rudely in my face. If that wasn't suspicious enough behaviour for you, I was to learn that Pia went out on the town the following night, getting up cosy and personal with another young woman. Who behaves like this when their wife has suddenly gone missing? So there was something very odd about the whole situation that really left me feeling very unsettled and disturbed. A search party was naturally recruited to search for Nicola, but nothing was ever found, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And I feared the worst, as invariably did my parents, who were certain that my sister was dead. I decided to pay Doris Collymore an impromptu visit. Maybe the town psychic might be able to give me some clues as to the whereabouts of my sister. Imagine my surprise when she said to me, "I've been expecting you. Please come in." Doris led me into a dimly lit room and beckoned for me to sit down on the upholstered chair at the far corner of the room. She then proceeded to light a couple of candles and smudge the room with sage, which she said she was using to clear the energy. "You seem to know why I'm here, Doris," I said. "Well, of course I do," said Doris. "Everyone in town is talking about your sister's disappearance. We're all very sorry about what has happened." "Can you tell me where she might be?" I asked. "Well, she's here with me right now," said Doris. "What do you mean, here with you right now?" I asked, looking around the room, half expecting my sister to say boo and come running out of her hiding place. "There's no easy way to say this," said Doris, "but your sister has crossed over to the other side. She is no longer with us on the earth plane." "I will kill him," I shrieked. "He did this to her. I knew it the moment I laid eyes on the man. He's an evil character." "Calm down, Mr. Goldman. Your sister is very happy where she is. She's holding her baby girl in her arms. She tells me that she's met your other sister on the other side, and tells me that she looks a lot like your father." "I don't have another sister," I said. "Well, did your mother have a miscarriage at one time? Because your sister insists that she's met your sister." "I'm not sure about that," I said. "I have to find out from my mother about that. Your sister tells me that you must not be mad about what happened to her, and that she's not going to give you details of her death for that very reason." "I don't understand," I said. "The man wants locking up. He can't get away with murder like this." "What you need to understand, Mr. Goldman, is that spirit tends to see things very differently to us on the earth plane. Well, I don't know how to put it to you, Mr. Goldman, but it was agreed before she was born that she would exit the earth this way." "I don't know about all this," I said. "It all seems hocus-pocus to me, Doris. Now, I do respect you as a psychic, I really do, but you can't expect me to swallow up all this nonsense. I'm a religious man, and so is my sister. I find all this rather hard to fathom and understand. Get my sister to tell me something that you could not possibly know." "Very well, then. Your sister tells me she knows who hit you in the woods when you were attacked by a ghost." "What?" I said. "Who was it?" "She said the man's name is Elijah Bridgman. I gather he worked on the farm for the former owner of your property in the 1800s. Unfortunately, it would seem he has not crossed over to the light, because he's very frightened of going to hell. Your sister tells me that he wantonly killed one of the workers on the land who got the job he wanted as a farm manager all those years ago. It appears that in a jealous, furious outburst of rage, he killed the worker in cold blood and staged the incident to look like a dreadful, unfortunate accident. After the worker's tragic demise, he finally got the job as farm manager he'd always wanted. But the treachery and guilt of what he'd done hung over his life like a dark, insidious cloud, and he began to drink very heavily on the job to numb and suppress the disparaging feelings of self-reproach. Finally, in an intoxicated, inebriated state, he was fired from his job, and subsequently chose to hang himself on a large tree in the Little Elf Grove. So he walks around the woods in a rage like a lost soul, as he's angry about being stuck here on the earth plane. He wants to cross over to the light, but is terrified to do so, for fear of being condemned to hell for an eternity." "Wow," I said to Doris. "My sister told you that?" "Yes, she did, Mr. Goldman. She's asked me to tell you that she loves you, but to move on with your life and to be happy, for she will see you again." "Where is she buried?" I asked. "The least we can do is to give her a decent send-off." "She tells me she's in a body of water, and that's all she's prepared to reveal." "Whereabouts?" I asked. "I wish I could tell you," said Doris, "but your sister has left now." To cut a long story short, My mother confirmed that she had indeed lost a baby to a miscarriage, and I discovered that there was a man by the name of Elias that had indeed hung himself in the little Pixie Grove. So all these years later, I am at a loss as to what really happened to my sister, as her body has never ever been found. So what did happen to Nicola Goldman Graham? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Anthea, and I'm from the mid-Atlantic state of Maryland, which is defined by its many waterways and coastline in an area called Chesapeake Bay. We have over 60 mountain ranges here and plenty of exquisite emerald green undulating countryside in the western part of the county, which consists of Washington, Allegheny and Garrett counties, and is regarded as a quintessential part of Appalachia. I grew up on a very idyllic, awe-inspiring stretch of land overlooking exquisite panoramic views, which was situated in close proximity to a very charming, fabulously quirky mountain town that was full of the most warm, congenial people that you could ever hope to meet, as the southerly hospitality has always been so generous and open-hearted. We've always been pretty much on first-name terms with most of the locals here. On our farm we grow orchards of delicious eating apples, and we even have a small personalised vineyard of eating grapes, which are rarely for our own personal consumption, as my family loves eating grapes, most especially my father. But we do tend to offload some of the excess produce at the local farmers' market. We also grow blueberries, strawberries, and the largest pumpkins you've ever seen. Golden cherry orchards are situated around exquisite pastures, rolling hills of verdant green countryside, along with a couple of ponds, plenty of hiking trails, and ubiquitous areas of dreamy forest consisting of hardwood trees like hickories and oaks. I grew up in a very spacious old-world colonial two-storey home with my mother and father and my older brother Caleb, who was 8 years my senior. Growing up as a young girl, the first time I encountered a Bigfoot was when I went to pick up some juicy grapes in the vineyard. I was about 10 years old at the time, and that was when I noticed this very large critter sitting on the ground with its back turned away from me. I remember being so startled, for the critter looked exactly like a bear from its back view, only this creature had auburn-coloured hair, the very same texture and length of a red setter's. I knew by then that bears did not have hair colouring like that. I think the creature must have sensed my presence, because all of a sudden the head and shoulders swivelled around to face me. I found myself staring into the most beautiful, intriguing brown eyes that I've ever seen. I say beautiful because they were warm, inquisitive and congenial eyes that did not possess an ounce of malice or hostility. Even though the critter's presence was clearly intimidating, I wasn't remotely frightened, because I could sense that it was kind, and being only 10 at the time, I was much more inclined to trust my instincts. The strange-looking creature was very definitely female, based on her feminine matriarchal energy and her small pert breasts. She was eating grapes, and generously stretched out her overlong arm and hands, handing me a large bunch for myself. I took them from her and sat down on the ground, about a foot away from the creature, and we ate the grapes together. I was so inquisitive and inquiring about the creature because she possessed such a human face, but there were aspects to her that rather reminded me of an ape, in particular her long, lanky arms, and the pyramid shape of her head with its slight pointed tip. The long hairless face, however, was exceedingly human, with a leathery tan-coloured complexion, flat nose and prominent sloped forehead. We both sat on the ground just staring curiously at each other, and I truly believe that she was as fascinated and as interested in me as I was in her. It was rather hilarious because we both deliberately, intentionally copied each other by popping grapes into our mouths at exactly the same time while we chewed our grapes silently. No words were exchanged between the two of us, but it truly felt as if we connected on an intimate level. I could feel the creature's genuine warmth towards me. I truly felt enveloped by her friendship. I can honestly say I've never experienced that same level of warmth from a human being before, apart from my own parents, of course. Finally, the creature stood up off the ground, and that was when I was in for the shock of my life, as I was not prepared for how big she actually was, as the creature towered at about 8 foot tall and was approximately 3 foot wide along the shoulder line and possibly 600 pounds. I would describe her as muscular, powerful, lofty and majestic, and of course incredibly strong, but lean and sinewy, with long legs that may appear short if you take into consideration that her arms were disproportionately long, so much so that she could have possibly touched her toes without even bending over. The kind creature took my basket from me and proceeded to pick some of the grapes that were harder for me to reach, as the best ones were on the higher elevation, and she knew my limitations in regards to my height, and she graciously handed me my basket filled to the brim with the juiciest hand-picked grapes. After that she rubbed her stomach very contentedly, as if to say that she was full, and I watched in wondrous awe as she glided away so gracefully on her long legs, glancing towards me briefly and giving me a quick nod of her head. And then she disappeared into the wooded grove of hickory trees, and then she was gone from my sight. I remember hightailing it home as fast as I could to tell my mother what I'd seen. I was so enthused and excited that I could hardly find the words to gather together to tell her what I'd encountered. "Oh, Ma'am, it was big. It was like a bear from behind. Its eyes, oh, they were so kind. It had hair like a red setter, you know, that lovely red colour. But it looked human, only it wasn't quite. It's hard to describe, really." "Calm down, dear," my mother had said. "You've just seen a Bigfoot, but you mustn't tell a solitary soul about your experience." She warned me that there were people out there who truly wished to harm such creatures, and for their own protection we were never to ever acknowledge their existence to anyone outside our immediate family. I remember being appalled by this revelation. I couldn't imagine in my wildest dreams who would want to harm such a gentle, loving creature who had won over my small little heart with her gentle countenance and kindly character. One day a dark taxi drew up our long gravel driveway, and as the car door slammed behind the dark silhouette, Olivia, my mother's sister, came into my focus, and she quickly climbed out of the back seat of the car, along with her 5-year-old daughter Jasmine. She promptly ambled over to the rear of the taxi and began dragging all kinds of boxes, bags and suitcases from the trunk. "For what do I owe this wonderful pleasure?" said my mother, rushing out of the house to warmly embrace her sister with a large, generous hug. "What's all this?" she said, eyeing the contents of her sister's life scattered across the driveway. "I'm moving in with you for a while," Olivia promptly announced. "I need to escape from Hassan." Hassan was a young Moroccan man that my mother's sister had met over the internet 8 long years ago, and she had fallen madly in love with the tall, dark, handsome Muslim, and she was intending to marry him with or without her parents' approval. I think she was attracted to the exotic culture and the fact that this man appeared so different to the American men that she had previously dated over the years. My mother's parents were not happy about this online relationship, as they didn't approve of Olivia going outside the American culture for love. But Olivia was defiant, rebellious, headstrong and determined, and she would never listen to sound advice. The more you told Olivia not to dive into the shark-infested tank, the more determined she was to do so, and wild horses would not be able to drag her away. "No good will ever come of this relationship, Olivia dear," her father had told her. "What do you really know about this man? About his background and his family roots? What are Hassan's motives in actually marrying you? You are not Muslim. Why would he marry outside his own religion and his culture? It makes no sense to me. Does this gentleman secretly hanker after a green card, I wonder, so that he can leave his native Morocco and seek out a better life for himself here in America? It strikes me that his motives are highly nefarious." "We're in love with each other," protested Olivia. "It's got nothing to do with the green card. Why can't any of you understand that? Why do you have to be so cynical and suspicious? You wouldn't be giving me the 3rd degree if he was American, would you? It's so hypocritical." "I'm only concerned about you, Olivia," her father had told her. "I'm sorry if I'm suspicious, but something doesn't feel right about all this. Why could you not meet a nice American boy? All this looking abroad for love is not wise as far as I'm concerned. You hear about American men all the time, rushing off to Russia for a wife, and no good ever comes from any of those relationships. Believe me, I've heard some stories. It's not easy marrying someone from a different culture, let me assure you of that." Olivia had been angry and incensed with both her parents and had promptly flown to Morocco, where she went to stay with Hassan's family in the town of Asila, which is one of North Morocco's hidden gems that overlooks the Atlantic Ocean and possesses a quintessential nautical atmosphere, where you can hear the ocean waves crashing against the Medina as you walk down the enchanting quiet streets of the town. Olivia had been warmly embraced and welcomed by Hassan's family, who were only too delighted about Olivia joining the family, and they entertained her lavishly with the most generous hospitality, where she had dined on delicious Moroccan tagines, which are stews cooked in clay pots with meat and vegetables, which was served with flat bread. I gather that Hassan's sisters taught her how to cook Moroccan food while she stayed there, just to please Hassan, and that should have been her first red flag. The two lovebirds had returned to America to get married, and despite their grievances, my grandparents had finally agreed to the marriage, but their hearts were weighed down heavily with nagging doubts and bitter regrets, especially after they had met Hassan for themselves. "I don't trust him," my grandmother had said. "His dark eyes are so shifty, and he never maintains eye contact with you while he talks. I've never trusted people like that. I think he is a duplicitous, shady character." "I agree," my grandfather had said. "You mark my words, that man is going to break our daughter's heart into 1,000 pieces, and we'll end up having to pick up all the broken bits and piece them together again." My grandmother had heartily agreed. "You know what, sweetheart," she'd said to her husband, "we cannot wrap Olivia up in cotton wool, nor can we protect her from the big bad world out there. We have to be like the eagles, who drop their youngsters into the sky and have to trust that their little eaglet will fly on its own. We have to learn to adopt that same kind of faith and believe that whatever happens to Olivia is for her greatest and highest good, even if no good comes out of this relationship with Hassan. As is the case with everything in life, she will gain some important lessons from her experiences. When everything falls apart in this relationship of hers, we'll be there to help her rebuild her life again. That is all that we can do." It seemed like my grandparents' less than rosy, gloomy predictions and far from favourable premonitions about Olivia's relationship with Hassan had finally come true, as here she was at our colonial home, running away from a life she had so eagerly embraced years earlier, as nothing was going to stop her from marrying Hassan. How different things were now, as my aunt looked more determined than ever to abandon her old life, like a serpent shedding its old skin and embracing the new. "Don't go telling Mum and Dad that I left Hassan," said Olivia to my mother. "I don't think I could handle the 'I told you so' smug, rather self-satisfied expressions on their faces if I tell them the good news. Don't be so hard on our parents. They only wanted the best for you, and neither of them trusted Hassan. They thought he was a sly, guileful and cunning fox." "Well, they weren't wrong about that," piped Olivia. "What on earth happened?" asked my mother, helping her sister to unpack her things in one of the spare rooms. "I thought you were head over heels in love with Hassan. You swore with all your heart that he was your knight in shining armour, and you were going to live together happily ever after, like the fairy tales." "Oh, please don't remind me of how impressionable and pathetically naive I was back in those days. When I look back now, I can hardly believe how gullible I was to fall for Hassan's charming tongue. Because let me tell you something, he's anything but beguiling," she said, lifting up her sleeves to show my mother her black bruises on her arms. "Hassan did this to you?" my mother asked, looking appalled. "Well, the physical abuse has been happening for a long while," Olivia admitted. "I don't know whether it's his culture or not, but Hassan has absolutely no respect for women. I think he feels that women are inferior to men. He actually told me that once. Well, not in so many words, but I got the underlying message anyway. When Hassan gets angry, he's not adverse to beating me up rather violently. He seems to believe it is his God-given right and duty to do so. It's almost like he regards me as a thing or a possession rather than a human being with emotions and feelings. He's always expected me to wait on him diligently like a servant. He even tells me that I'm inferior to the women in Morocco who know exactly how to treat a man. I also notice that he doesn't ever regard my opinion as being of worth or value. It's like he truly believes that women are inferior. That's appalling, said my mother. Well, the abuse has been getting infinitely worse since I discovered he was secretly talking to other women online, professing his undying love to them, although some of them he's never even met. Why would he do something like that? My mother asked. You've always been a beauty, and besides you have a wonderful daughter together. No one in their right mind would risk throwing all that away for a quick frolic in the hay, surely. It doesn't make any sense at all. Hassan has always had an eye for the ladies, said Olivia. I knew that when we got married, but I naively and foolishly trusted that when we settled down together that he would become a loyal, devoted family man. But it seems that he is so intent on chasing a bit of skirt, and I know he's been cheating on me behind my back. So I firmly told him that enough was enough, and that I wanted a divorce. And after much pleading and begging me to change my mind about ending the marriage, I refused his requests. So he promptly locked me up in my bedroom and bathroom ensuite for an entire month like an animal. He what? Asked my mother, looking horrified. You heard, said Olivia. He locked me up in my bedroom. But I did manage to escape when he left the key in the lock. I did that newspaper trick to retrieve the key from under the door, and it worked like a charm. Once he left the house, I escaped and grabbed my stuff and collected Jasmine from playgroup, and here I am now. When he finds we've gone, he's going to go ballistic, especially as Jasmine is his world. He'll stop at nothing to get her back. I suspect a divorce from me he will finally accept, but having joint custody with Jasmine is something he would never accept. Oh, my goodness, said my mother. What if he comes after you to abduct Jasmine? Well, the good news is that Hassan does not know that you live here in Maryland, nor does he know your husband's last name. I mean, how will he ever find us? We can hide out here. Olivia, said my mother, you really are incredibly naive, easily deceived and led astray. There are indeed ways and means for Hassan to find you, if he's desperate enough. He could also hire a private detective. It's not that hard, you know. Oh, please, said Olivia. He won't find me here. When Jasmine is old enough, I'll homeschool her, and I won't keep her out of my sight for a moment. I won't let that monster of a husband of mine near Jasmine. And so it was that Olivia and Jasmine moved into our home, but my parents weren't entirely convinced that Hassan would not eventually find out where Olivia was living. There was a strong possibility that he might try and abduct his child and whisk her over to Morocco, and then we might never see her again. We hoped for the best and crossed our fingers that this would invariably never happen. I always enjoyed taking care of my little cousin, as Jasmine was a very joyful, exuberant child, and much like her mother, she had an obstinate, opinionated and headstrong mind all of her own, which made her all the more endearing to me. One day when we were picking apples in the orchard together, Jasmine got animated and began pointing at something. It's a bear, she said, jumping up and down excitedly and running towards the red-headed critter, who I recognised at once as the Bigfoot that I'd seen in the vineyard a month earlier. I perceived that the reticent Bigfoot wanted indeed to be seen, as in some way I'd established a rapport with her in the vineyard, and I think she was eager to acknowledge me again, much like an old friend, and I was thrilled to see her. I could not believe my niece's audacity, because she brazenly and boldly ran up to the Bigfoot, crying out in an excited frenzy, "Big teddy bear! Big teddy bear! Big teddy bear!" Her tiny body grabbed onto the hair on the Bigfoot's calves with her tiny hands. An adult would have considered the Bigfoot to be very scary and a Herculean monster, but to Jasmine she was an oversized, very agreeable-looking teddy bear. I was not disturbed about this outward display of affection on my cousin's part, as I knew that this Bigfoot was kind. She bent down into a squatting position to make herself smaller for Jasmine, patting the child's hair affectionately and cradling her in her overlong arms. The Bigfoot was looking up at me with an amused expression on her face, as if to say, "What a cute child!" It would seem that she was a mother herself, for she knew exactly how to embrace Jasmine in only the way that a mother would. At that moment my Aunt Olivia, who was looking for Jasmine, had learnt that she was in the orchard with me picking apples, unexpectedly arrived on the scene. Olivia began to scream like a banshee when she saw the Bigfoot creature cuddling her daughter. "Shoo!" she screamed. "Shoo! Get your hands off my child! Out of here at once!" she said, treating the Bigfoot like some kind of disagreeable dog that was behaving badly. At that moment, the alarmed Bigfoot released her hold on Jasmine and fled through the orchard, looking ever so rattled. Olivia began to scream at me. "What were you doing, Anthea, allowing that monster to hold my child? Are you mad? Can you see the size of the thing? It could have killed my daughter. What were you thinking?" "It wasn't a monster," I told Olivia. "It was a Bigfoot, and she's my friend, if you must know. And Jasmine was the one who tried to cuddle the Bigfoot. It wasn't the other way round." "Well, why didn't you stop her, Anthea? You're 10 years old, for goodness sake, and Jasmine is only 5. I thought I could trust you to look after your cousin, but you're clearly still only a baby." "I'm not a baby," I protested. "I'm 10 years old. I'm a big girl now." Olivia grabbed her daughter and scolded her. "Jasmine, Mummy does not want you playing with that Bigfoot. Do you understand?" "But Mummy, I like the bear. I want to play with the bear." "I don't care how nice the bear is," said Olivia. "You're not going to play with the bear. Do you understand? Mummy will be very cross, and you won't get the doll I promised you if you disobey." Jasmine began to howl like a baby. "I want to play with the bear." Olivia paid her little attention and marched her into the house, looking back at me with an aggrieved expression on her face as if to say, "Now look what you've done, Anthea. I hope you're happy with yourself." Anthea was letting my child play with a Bigfoot, she complained bitterly to my mother. Until today I didn't even know such a creature existed. This thing was the size of a grizzly bear. It could potentially have hurt my child. My mother surprised me by being surprisingly defensive towards the Bigfoot. "Those Bigfoot have been on our land for generations, Olivia. Do you know that my father's father had relationships with the creatures? They will never harm a little child," my mother assured her. "Well, how do you know about that?" Olivia shouted. "You can't be sure of anything. You don't know what those creatures are capable of." My mother tried to console Olivia. "Anthea and her brother have had free rein playing on this property since they were as little as Jasmine, and even smaller. If the Bigfoot here were going to abduct any of our children, I assure you they would have done so a long time ago, because they'd have had plenty of opportunity. They've been living on our property for generations now, and we coexist happily together." I could tell my mother was very defensive, and I suspect in some way the Bigfoot have helped her in her life, but if they have, she was not intending to share her personal account with us, as it was clearly very special to her. One day when Jasmine was finger-painting with Olivia in the front yard, under the old oak tree, she quickly ran inside to answer a call of nature, leaving her daughter for a second. Well, that's what she told us, but a second could easily have been 5 minutes or so, as Olivia had no real concept of time. When she did return, her daughter had simply vanished into thin air. Olivia became frantic and began screaming so loudly that her voice could be heard for miles away. She believed that her son was probably responsible for Jasmine's disappearance, but she couldn't be sure, and she didn't want to overlook the fact that the Bigfoot she had seen holding her child could have chosen to abduct her. An investigation was launched, including an extensive search for Jasmine, but no trace of her was ever found. It would seem one of our neighbours claimed to see a white BMW car driving up our driveway about the very same time that Jasmine went missing. Both the Moroccan police and the Maryland force were involved in the prolonged, fruitless investigation, but the Moroccan police were not particularly helpful and were very evasive. Hassan was found living in Florida with another woman who was heavily pregnant with his child. He claims he has no knowledge as to the whereabouts of his daughter, but his behaviour in regards to this matter was bizarre, for he did not appear remotely concerned about the fact that Jasmine was now missing. For a father who is seemingly besotted over his own daughter, he did little to assist the police in their investigation, and refused to take a lie detector test, which does suggest he knows where his daughter is, but there has been no sight or sound of her since she vanished. It would seem that a visit to Morocco did little to calm Olivia's nerves, or to inspire any hope for her in this hopelessly heartbreaking situation. Hassan's family members were very circumspect, cagey and guarded about the entire matter, and claimed not to know as to the whereabouts of Jasmine. Yet they also appeared not to be concerned about the fact that she was missing, which in itself was peculiar. Olivia was convinced they were covering up for Hassan, as they treated her coldly and were aloof and secretive. The Moroccan police have not been of any assistance either, and despite hiring private investigators, no one is any the wiser as to what happened to poor little Jasmine. But someone clearly knows something. Olivia has now divorced Hassan and is still living on our property, and has a fiancé who's a very likeable American gentleman, and she is now 6 months pregnant and is expecting a baby girl in the fall. As my grandparents so correctly predicted, Olivia had to rebuild her life from scratch, and not a single day goes by when she does not think of her precious Jasmine. I also miss my cousin very much. I've had a handful of unexpected encounters with a red-haired Bigfoot since Jasmine disappeared. I've chosen to call her Fleck of Gold because of her magnificent red hair. I'm in no doubt that Fleck of Gold, or any of her family members for that matter, whom I've never actually encountered, have absolutely got nothing to do with Jasmine's vanishing. My suspicions firmly lie at the door of the Darby household, but no one in that family is admitting to anything, and they probably never will. So what did happen to Jasmine Darby?
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hayley, and my story happened in the 60s when I was about 18 years old at the time. I was living with my parents in Houston in Texas and had subsequently found myself a very appealing waitressing job at a diner in a quaint, rather charming mountain town in North Carolina. I fancied a brand new change of scene, and taking the job seemed like a fabulous, ingenious idea for an adventurous person like myself. I fancied a spot of adventure in a peaceful, tranquil part of the world, where I could finally breathe in the fresh, exhilarating mountain air, and enjoy a spot of horse riding down some of the rugged mountainous trails. I wanted a break from all the hard-going, weary years of study, doing my level best to procure good grades, just to appease my somewhat draconian, rather demanding parents. My parents weren't too enamoured with this whimsical, fanciful idea of mine. They were desirous for me to get a degree as soon as humanly possible. In truth, I had absolutely no idea what I actually wanted to do with my life. Why go down a rabbit hole if you're not sure where it would ultimately lead? I wasn't prepared to recklessly expend all my energy on an ambiguous, indefinite career. I knew of people who had spent 2 years studying engineering, only to abandon that to study law. In my opinion, that was a dreadful waste of unnecessary overkill, with way too much wasted energy, and I didn't want that to be my story, which could so easily have been the case in that chapter of my life. In the end, my parents had reluctantly agreed that perhaps I needed some space to find myself before I decided what I ultimately wanted to do with my life. My mother had approached the pastor for some wise counsel, expressing her misgivings about me wanting to take up a job as a waitress in some remote mountain town, way off the beaten track. "My daughter is so bright and intelligent, Pastor. Why would she want to waste her energy waiting tables in a remote country town of all things? I fear she's taken leave of her senses." "Let her be," the pastor had told them. "If she wants a change of scene, then let her experience something new. I don't think waiting tables ever did anyone harm. In my experience, a spirit of servitude is not a bad thing, as it humbles the soul. You mark my word, your daughter has a wise head on those young shoulders of hers. I can see she does not want to dive into the water before testing the temperature. That isn't a bad thing at all. It doesn't do anyone any harm to take a break, to make their life decisions."
"So you think we should let her go, Pastor?" my mother had asked.
"Absolutely," said the pastor. "The Lord works in the most unlikely of ways, for it would seem that the mountains are whispering your daughter's very name."
And so it was my diffident parents had begrudgingly and very disparagingly agreed for me to take up a job as a waitress in a mountain town, which is invariably exactly what I did. I was able to answer an advert in the paper for room and board at a local farm.
And so there I was in North Carolina, trekking down the large dirt road lined by elevated hilly embankments on either side that spread out into vast open, glorious-looking meadows that were hedged in by poled fencing belonging to neighbouring farms, where I observed horses grazing happily in the fields, and the area was liberally scattered with trees. I continued walking down the road with my suitcase in my hand and a long handbag draped over my right shoulder. Finally I reached the wrought-iron cattle gate with the sign that read Ivy Ridge. This was the place. I was relieved to find it. I opened the squeaky farm gate, that was well in need of a good oiling, and ambled down the long driveway until I reached the quaint cobbled path that led to the pretty little whitewashed symmetrical farmhouse full of rustic old-world charm, with large inviting French windows that overlooked the panoramic silvery blue silhouettes of the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. And then there was the undulating verdant countryside that was scattered with ubiquitous trees, a silvery pond, a couple of pretty barns, not to mention a sizable stable block. There were some handsome bay and black horses grazing in the open meadow that was enclosed with some pole fencing. As I approached the gleaming white front door, there must have been over a dozen chickens pecking away at the ground. They barely even acknowledged my presence as I knocked. They were so intent on foraging for a few tasty worms. I was surprised when the door was finally opened by a very attractive young woman with long dark hair, fair skin, and pretty blue eyes, who appeared not to be much older than myself. She was wearing a lovely summer's dress and gave me a bright, cheerful smile. "Hi," I said. "I'm here about the advert in the paper, about a room and board. Is your mother in?" The girl laughed, a pretty musical laugh. "I'm the one who put the ad in the paper," she said. "My husband's a travelling salesman, and he's out on the road all the time, so I thought I'd let out the room. It gets so lonely out here on my own. I think you'll do very nicely. Do come in, and please put that suitcase down." "How old are you?" I asked. "Excuse my impertinence, but you don't look much older than myself." "Well, you're not wrong there," she said. "I'm about 21. "You're only 3 years older than I am," I said, looking appalled. "How old were you when you got married?" "Oh, 18, she said, looking ever so slightly bashful. "I know what you're thinking, but I'm not an academic. It suits me to manage a farm, as it's all I really know. And besides, I love being married. My husband is a remarkable man. I knew when he was 8 years old that he was the one for me. But he is a year younger than I am, so we are rather a young couple." "You're the youngest couple I know," I said. "Well, it was a logical next step for us. We've loved each other for ever and a day. More to the point, what brings someone like you to a quaint little country town like ours? I imagine you have a story of your own to share." "Not really. I've just reached a crossroads in my life, if you like, and I don't really know exactly what to do with myself anymore. So I thought a stint in a mountain town, far away from home, would perhaps help me to make up my mind about what ultimately I'd like to end up doing with my life. Also, let's not kid, I've always adored the mountains, and I love open countryside, and a break from Houston is exactly what I need right now." "You're really strange," laughed the girl. "Most people would travel the world to find themselves, but you've chosen to live in a quaint mountain town like ours for a while." It would seem that in a trice Susan and I had become very close, solid and firm friends, and in all our spare time we spent together we would ride down the rugged country roads, either on the back of horses or on mountain bicycles. We would also take long hikes into the enchanted wood grove at the rear of her property that was full of red maples, pine and oak trees. It was a beautiful tranquil oasis where we would invariably picnic regularly by the silvery stream that meandered through the valley. And this shaded retreat, with its statuesque tall trees, was indeed very beguiling. I was to learn that Susan's husband was a travelling salesman that sold Bibles, gold crosses and religious candles out of the trunk of his car. And he would travel to far-out places, stay at regular motels or cabins, and return home after a few days. One evening while I was lying in bed, I heard a very strange, ominous, somewhat airy sound that sent chills down my spine and caused me to sit up in bed, feeling ever so slightly uneasy. Someone was clearly creeping around the property, and I could hear something being dragged across the floor in the entrance hall. "Calm down," I heard a man's voice say. "It's only me." "You scared the living daylights out of me," came Susan's voice. "I thought we had an intruder on the property. What were you doing creeping around like this? I was about to knock you out with this metal candlestick of mine." "Good job you didn't then," said the man. "I didn't want to waken you up at once, that's all." Then I could hear Susan's voice crying out, "What have you done, Rolf? What the heck have you done? Are you kidding me? This is not a joke." On hearing Susan's dismayed tone in her voice, I immediately quickly ventured into the entrance hall to find out what all the alarming commotion was about, as my curiosity had finally got the better of me. As I made my appearance known in the entrance hall, a very attractive young man with dark brown hair looked up at me with hazel brown, rather startled-looking eyes. It appeared that he was exceedingly young, only about 19 or 20 years old, much like myself. "Who is this, Susan?" he asked, looking at me with a befuddled, dumbfounded expression upon his face. "Oh, this is our new lodger, Haley," said Susan. "While you've been away on the road, I thought I should get a companion for myself to take board in one of our spare rooms." "Why did you not tell me about this?" he said. "Rolf, I don't have to tell you everything," Susan chided. I looked down at the weighted sleeping bag upon the floor, and I nearly had a heart attack on the spot, because I could see a man's large hand fall out of the cover, and I knew without a doubt that he was deceased. In that moment I was so agog that my eyes grew as round as saucers, and my jaw dropped to the ground in disbelief. I was almost too shocked and appalled by what I was beholding that I was rendered tongue-tied and speechless. "It's not what it looks like," said Rolf, looking at the mortified, affronted expression upon my face. "I didn't murder this man, if that is what you are thinking. In truth, I do not really know who on earth he is. Well, not exactly." "What on earth are you talking about, Ralph? What does not exactly mean?" asked Susan. "If you don't even know this man, what in God's name is he doing lying dead in our entrance hall of all things? If you had nothing to do with this man's untimely death, why on earth would you bring his corpse back to our house? You better have some good explaining to do, Rolf, because from where I'm standing, things are looking bleaker by the second for you." "Give me a chance to explain myself, please," said Rolf. "It's a very long story." So this was the story he told us. "I was given an address where I was to meet this man, the one lying dead here on the floor right now. I was informed that he'd be interested in buying a handful of Bibles from me to donate to his local church. He was a terribly nice, congenial and friendly man. I liked him from the moment I met him. I was delighted as he promptly insisted on placing a large order with me as a nice charitable donation for his church. I think he must have ordered over 100 Bibles and wrote me a sizable cheque. I gave him all the Bibles he ordered in several boxes. This man's wife came upon the scene into the room where we were chatting, and she looked exactly like a witch. I have no other way to describe her to you. She sent the chills down my spine. There is no subtle way to put this, but she looked like the kind of woman who knew exactly how to manipulate men, with a little unscrupulous flirtation, if you know what I mean, and have them eating out of her hands like an obedient lap dog. It was rather peculiar, because she insisted her husband took me to the local diner to try out their delicious burgers. I think even her husband was surprised by such an unusual suggestion on her part, but dutifully he obeyed her orders. We went to the diner together and were welcomed there by all the locals in town, who were very pleased to see us. Actually, we had a rather good time, and the food was delicious. Later that day I returned to the motel room from where I'd been staying. I was planning to stay there for 3 more days, said Rolf. It would seem there was a great deal of interest in my Bibles from the locals in town, and it looked like there were people desirous to order some books from me, and I was very pleased about that. Shortly after my lunch in the diner, I discerned a metallic smell in my room, rather reminding me of iron in blood, which I did think was peculiarly odd, but I didn't give the matter much attention. By the 3rd day of my stay, I noticed that there were flies buzzing around my room. I got a creepy, nauseating feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. It smelt like something was going off, like rancid meat. I began to search for the source of the smell, and imagine my surprise when I looked under my bed, only to discover this man's dead corpse lying there, whom I recognised immediately as the man I'd been lunching with at the diner 3 days prior. What in God's name was he doing under my bed, deceased, in a motel room of all things? It sent the fear of the living God into every fibre of my being. I freaked out upon seeing the dead body, and realised I'd been deliberately set up. I think the man must have been dead for 3 long days, despite the air conditioning that was very cold in the room, which I imagine dramatically slowed down the decomposition process. Well, I do believe a malicious, vindictive and cold-hearted person out there, with no conscience whatsoever, intends to guilefully frame me for this man's murder, and I'm not having any of it. Think about it. I was the last person seen with him alive in town. I believe someone surreptitiously put him under the bed so that when the cleaner came to attend to the motel room after I finally left the premises, the body would be recovered. They would automatically link it back to me, and I would be falsely accused of this man's murder. There are local witnesses in that town that will confirm that I was the last person seen with him alive, and this whole thing is just a living nightmare as far as I'm concerned. But who would do such a callous, evil thing? Gasped Susan. Someone who wants to eliminate this nice man and shift the blame to me. Possibly that hideous wife of his. I wouldn't put anything past that snake of a woman.
So you decided to bring back the deceased body here so that we could dispose of it, did you? I mean, didn't it occur to you, Rolf, that this man deserves a decent funeral and a proper burial, said Susan.
It's worse than you can imagine, Susan, said Rolf. Whoever has set me up has been remarkably clever and very guileful, because they stole my revolver surreptitiously without me knowing from the glove compartment of my car. It's amazing that they even knew I owned a weapon. I believe they cunningly killed this poor man using my revolver to set me up. I guarantee you I'm the only one that has handled my gun without gloves. So I really have been framed for this murder. I discovered upon examining my revolver that a couple of my bullets had been used. I'm so grateful I checked this out, or I'd be none the wiser in regards to this curious matter. I'm almost certain those bullets are now in this man's head. What did this man ever do to deserve this heinous, despicable treatment, I ask you?
How on earth did they manage to break into your car and into your motel room? Asked Susan, without your ever finding out. Well, there are ways and means, like skeleton keys and picking locks. It's amazing what criminals can do these days for seamless crimes, I said. You hear all about them. Rolf, I hope you clean that motel room properly, said Susan, especially under the bed, in case there's a blood trail there. Of course I did. And I'll also make sure I clean out the trunk of my car rigorously to ensure that there is no blood detected there that could potentially lead back to me. You are telling us the truth, I asked Rolf. Of course he is, Haley, said Susan. Rolf would never maliciously kill someone, never on purpose. I've known him all my life when he was a little boy of about 8 years old, and he was so upset if even a fledgling died from its nest. He was always sensitive about death, worse than me, and I can be a big baby, let me tell you. I'm afraid I have to agree with you, Rolf. It would appear that you have been set up and framed for this man's murder. You could end up falsely accused for a crime you didn't commit, and you would pay the ultimate sentence of either the death penalty or life in prison. Whoever this insidious person is, they'll stop at nothing to make you end up paying this price for his untimely death. I gather there are so many falsely accused people put in prison these days for crimes they did not commit, due to bribery, botched police investigations, cover-ups, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, policemen are only human like ourselves, so it's easy for them to mess up an investigation and get their wires crossed. It happens all the time. Well, what are we going to do with the body? Asked Susan. Because we have to get rid of it. Because whatever way you look at it, the police will be questioning you. You are the last person that was seen with him alive,
and so the accusory fingers will be clearly pointed at you." "Well, we need to get rid of the body now," said Ralph. "We better bury it in the woods, and we need to do it now before the sun begins to rise, because we cannot afford to be seen by a living soul." As you can imagine, everything that unfolded that night was so surreal for me. It almost felt like I was playing a role in a horrifying but thrilling movie. We were going to be burying a dead body in the woods after all. It seemed so incredibly dramatic, and dare I even say exciting and exhilarating. Well, it would have been, of course, if it wasn't so desperately sad and unfortunate. Yet I knew we needed to protect Rolf, because no one deserved to go down for a murder that they didn't commit. It was clear to me that he was innocent of this crime. I knew it in the depths of my heart that he was incapable of committing murder. I could see he was a genuinely kind man who needed to get out of this woeful and pitiful sticky mess that he had become so inauspiciously embroiled in. And so it was at about 11:30 at night, the three of us cautiously crept out of the house like furtive burglars, carrying the heavy rolled-up corpse into the woods. We were all wearing headlamps and carrying spades, and we proceeded warily on our way. It was a mesmerising night, with a scattering of stars and a large white full moon that glistened in the sky, and offered the night sky a generous, somewhat ethereal luminescence that afforded us excellent visibility. There was a gentle, cool breeze that caused the leaves of the branches to rustle and blow in the wind. It would seem that even the tall, imposing trees were cognizant and sentient of the secret that lay confined in the sleeping bag we carried. We could hear the cheerful nightly chorus of the crickets and frogs as we ambled ever so quietly into the woods, with the stealth of a leopard, the cunningness of a fox, and the determination you can only ever find in a pack of wolves. Our untimely presence did, however, startle a couple of raccoons who were scampering up a tree branch, and of course a lone fox that crossed our path. I noticed that it glanced at us ever so briefly, with a rather confused, bewildered look upon its face, and then it hastily retreated into the depths of the woods. I was struck by how alluring it was out here on this magical, bewitching night, which seemed rather incongruous with the daunting task that lay ahead of us. We began to dig a hole in an area under a large oak tree that looked like an agreeable resting place. All of a sudden, everything went quiet in the woods, and it was as if the hushed nightly chorus just dissipated until it faded completely, leaving us with the sound of silence, and of course our gentle breathing. Then quite suddenly we could hear heavy footfall, and realised in a single moment of immense trepidation and consternation that someone was coming our way. But who, I couldn't imagine.
My heart sank because I was so terrified that the person who had framed Rolf for this insidious murder had somehow managed to follow us into the wood green, and who knows what surprises such a nefarious, crafty, artful individual was capable of unleashing upon us. "Someone is coming," I said. "Quick, hide!" We all took cover behind some trees, switching the lights off on our headlamps and staying incredibly still. But the light of the full moon offered a generous lighting effect that flickered throughout the trees and lit up all the dark shadows. Then we saw a silhouette of a creature so large that it was so hard to fathom. The sheer size of this thing was monumental. For whatever indeed it was built like a giant, but shaped like a human being, with long flowing pitch-black hair that covered its entire body. And whatever indeed this creature was, it was very muscular and burly, with a large barrel chest, overlong arms, human-like hands, and a very sizable cone-shaped head that seamlessly folded into the shoulders, with no apparent evidence of a neck. I could not see the details of the face at all because they were obscure, but the impression of the creature was it was like a giant wild man that was covered in hair. I could feel my heart rising rapidly in my chest and thumping violently, for this creature was the most terrifying thing that I beheld in my entire life, and whatever it was, it sent chills down my spine and turned my blood freezing cold. I was to learn later that both Susan and her husband Rolf were so overwhelmed by fear that they froze up like blocks of ice, and Rolf said if he had wanted to run from the creature, it would have been physically impossible to do so. He told me that his body just locked up and felt as heavy as a pillar of cement, as he was completely incapacitated.
We watched the curious creature gliding directly towards the hole we'd been digging, and then he proceeded to examine all our trowels very curiously,
which he replaced on the ground, seemingly rather unimpressed by our strange tools. He then glided over to the sleeping bag, and when he opened it and saw the dead corpse inside, he seemed rather bewildered at first, but then he just threw the sleeping bag containing the dead corpse over his shoulder like a massive sack of potatoes, and disappeared into the heart of the woods, moving away with such an extraordinary grace that the critter almost appeared to be floating. But where on earth was he going, I wondered. For a long moment no one moved. "Did you see that?" said Susan. "What in God's name was it? It looked like a massive human being, or even a demon of some kind." It wasn't a demon, I told Susan. It was a real creature. It looked like a giant human. I think it was about 8 foot tall, and at least 700 pounds. It was gargantuan. "It was a wild man of some kind," said Rolf. "The ancients used to ruminate about such creatures existing, but I wasn't aware that they were around in our time-space. Well, so much for burying the man. He's taken care of the problem for us. But I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, or whether it's a good thing or not." "What is he going to do with the body?" asked Susan. "Well, maybe he's going to eat it," said Rolf, "which is rather a strange way of disposing of evidence." As we walked back to the farmhouse, no one said a single word. We were completely dumbfounded by what had just transpired. It seemed so out of the realms of our reality. I truly think we would have been more comfortable with a mountain lion taking the corpse off, rather than this strange wild man. Until this point I never knew of such a strange creature even existing here in America, and it was so enigmatic and outlandish I had to keep asking Susan the following day, over and over again, if we really had seen what I thought we'd seen, or had I just been dreaming. "We saw a monstrous creature," she kept reassuring me, "a wild man of some kind. We weren't dreaming." "But what was it?" I asked. "Don't ask me," said Susan. "I haven't got a clue." As you can imagine, we weren't at all surprised when the sheriff finally arrived at our front doorstep, along with 2 plain-clothed policemen a couple of days later. I guess you could say we were rather expecting his visit. "Hello, Susan," said the sheriff. "Is your husband at home by any chance?" "Yes, he is," I said. "Come this way." I led the sheriff and the policeman into the living area, inviting them to make themselves comfortable on some of the upholstered chairs by the large marble fireplace. "I'll go and get him for you," she said. Susan and I both eagerly pinned our ears to the door, eavesdropping as we listened in to the policeman questioning Rolf. "We were informed that you were the last person to see Mr. Robert Kemble alive, as the 2 of you were seen eating together at the diner last Thursday at 1:30 p.m. to be precise. And now the man appears to have disappeared. I gather you have known Mr. Kemble for a rather long time, sir." "Really? Where did you get that idea from, officer?" "I'm a travelling salesman. I sell Bibles for a living from the trunk of my car. I only just met the man very briefly on Thursday morning, after learning that he was interested in making a generous donation to the church by investing in over 100 Bibles, which is a very sizable collection and a pleasing order, I may tell you." "Are you sure this is the first time you have ever met Mr. Kimball?" "Absolutely. Never seen him a day in my life before that, but a very agreeable, congenial man, I must add." "Oh, the wife seems to think you know him rather well. She suggests you were arguing about something together when she last saw you." "Well, if that was true, officer, I think we would have had a very awkward lunch at the diner. I don't think I could stomach a meal with someone I was having an altercation with. It might just upset my digestion. I think you will find we had a very agreeable lunch together. Delicious, actually, and very good company. I'm sure all the locals at the diner will testify to this fact, as we had a very good merry time. If I were you, officer, I would take a very long, hard look at this man's wife, who conveniently insisted at the time that we went to the diner for lunch. Even her husband told me that this was incongruous behaviour on her part. If you don't mind my saying, sir, this wife of his seems to be rather expediently accusing me of knowing her husband, which is not the case at all. And now I am seemingly implicated by her for arguing with him. It's all rather conveniently opportune, don't you think?"
"Well, we're just doing our inquiry, sir," said the policeman, "as the man seems to have completely vanished off the face of the earth, and you were the last person seen with him alive. But thank you for assisting us with our inquiries." And at that, they were gone. As you can imagine, I never expected that moving to a quiet, peaceful mountain town would invariably transpire to be so profoundly dramatic and electrifying. Nor did I envisage that I would become involved in covering up the evidence of a dead body to protect an innocent man. Nor did I comprehend that I would encounter such an erroneous, bizarre creature, which I was to learn later was actually a Bigfoot. To cut a long story short, the body of Robert Kemble was never ever found, which isn't surprising, really. It would seem the missing persons investigation was also exceedingly unfruitful, but one man came forward to the police to admit that Felicia Kemble had offered him a great amount of money to murder her husband, but he had refused the request. He suggested that Mrs. Kemble may have actually hired someone else to kill him. Unfortunately, she was never ever arrested for the crime, as the whistleblower's spurious claims were considered just that, hearsay. Many of the locals in the town believed that Mr. Kemble had run away from Felicia, as she was described as a treacherous, unsavoury character that had made his life a living hell. We also learnt that Felicia Kemble had been having a long-standing affair with a man whose father was a locksmith, so I think we can safely say that she was behind her husband's demise and was covering her own back, so to speak, by trying to place the blame at poor Rolf's door. In conclusion, I'm very glad to inform you that I did indeed enjoy my life living in a mountain town. I adored the slow, easy-going pace of life, the warm, convivial people, and the exquisite, idyllic mountain scenery. So much so, in fact, that I knew ultimately that this was the part of the world where I wanted to settle down. So it wasn't a crazy decision after all for me to take a year off to decide what it was that I wanted to do with my life. I decided that due to my love of children and education, to become an elementary school teacher. To this day I currently reside in a quaint little farm in close proximity to the charming mountain town. I'm now happily married, with 2 adult children of my own that have long since left home and got married themselves. Susan and Ralph are godparents to my oldest daughter and are still the very greatest of my friends. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.